Okay. Hello, everyone. Does everyone see this? Can everyone see the screen? Okay, cool. So today, um, I'm gonna just talk a little bit about what can building owners learn from COVID-19. Um, the agenda is as follows. I'm gonna start with a quick introduction of who we are, and then I'm gonna go into describing what is a crisis, and then the mechanisms for infection in a building, and then some solutions before ending with a quick conclusion. And this is really very much from our perspective. So I'll talk a little bit more about that after describing who we are. So, who we are. Um, we are Reset. We're an international standards and certifications body focused on healthy buildings. So, our first module is air quality. And the reason why we started this was because air quality is something that changes and fluctuates very quickly. This graph that you see here shows what happens when you're commissioning a space. So after construction, you're going to have a flush out phase where you get rid of all the VOCs and all the bad smells in the air. And then once you pass, you close all the windows again, and then that's when people move in. So with a lot of spaces we've seen traditionally, air quality always looks good when you're trying to pass after construction, but most spaces can't guarantee it. So what we were interested in was looking at something more long term, something that can guarantee that air quality was going to be good. And so we came up with an idea for essentially preventative medicine for buildings. So originally, health is based on health checkups that are sporadic. You might go once a year, probably even less because no one likes hospitals. A couple years ago, we started having online checkups where you could send the data, like you would send the data in, and then they would be able to give you some information back. So this was like 23andMe and others that could check your DNA. And recently, we're starting to see more live readings like an EKG or heart rate from an Apple Watch. So we're moving towards having access to quicker and faster data. And that's how Reset is looking at the world. We want to essentially monitor the data from a building live. And that's how our entire standard is set up. I'll talk a little bit more about this later as we go into solutions and how we play into that. So there will be more there. And lastly, just before I go on, commercial interiors and core shell, those are two pieces that we kind of target. So we target offices and we target entire buildings in regards to how you monitor. Our philosophy as a company is that you can only solve what you can measure. So our entire standard is based on measurement. So getting into number two, what is a crisis? A crisis is a problem that you cannot escape from, and it generates a certain amount of panic. So a crisis that happened a while back was the 2012 air apocalypse. So PM2.5, everyone suddenly realized it's much higher than we thought, mainly because what we saw as fog previously, now we know is pollution. So it's a problem. We couldn't escape it. It's everywhere. And there was a sense of panic because we didn't know what we could do about it. This became essentially an annual problem because technically this was happening the entire time. But because of suddenly understanding that this was actually PM2.5 pollution rather than just fog, there's a new awareness, and all of a sudden we started feeling fear, and there's a sense of risk towards everything. So from a building's perspective, this gets interesting because a building becomes more dangerous than outside. So what that means is traditionally indoor air quality has always been worse than outdoor air. And the reason for that is there's chemicals indoors. For example, the materials that you use in the space can off-gas VOCs. Additionally, you might have just in general indoor spaces you're generating dust, and part of that dust is PM2.5. So indoors is typically worse than outdoors. What a lot of places with good air quality would say is open your windows, just get more fresh air, right? But what do you do if the fresh air is all polluted? So much of the conversation back then was, how do you make this building that's almost like a death trap into a safe haven? And the solution for that was clean air. So to get clean air, you would have to add filtration. You would make sure that you have more restrictions around windows, so people aren't just opening the windows when the air quality was bad outside. But to understand that, you had to start monitoring, right? You had to monitor to understand when you could open windows, or when is the air quality good indoors. And so a lot of this becomes, how do you communicate the clean air? We actually encountered a lot of situations where there were a lot of projects where they had clean air, but because tenants they couldn't see it, you can't really feel the difference between clean air and semi-clean air, or the middle ground. So figuring out how to track the information and then publish it, show their tenants that they actually were providing them clean air, was important. And what this really means is, the solution for having a safe haven is to be able to communicate your clean air, being able to have the data to back it up, and to essentially build trust in the long term. So why am I talking about this? It's because 2020 COVID-19 is similar problem, although more immediate. So it's also a problem. You can't escape it, and there is general panic. Again, we can follow a similar way of looking at things, where we've had something similar to COVID-19 in the flu, but the flu is much less deadly, so it's not nearly as acute. And this COVID-19 is something new. It's something that we've never dealt with before. And again, it generates fear and risk. So this time, it's not about necessarily pollution, but it's a building is, again, a death trap because it's close quarters. It's an airborne virus, and it's easily transmittable. So that's why we all have to stay home. We have to stay within an environment where you're not close to other people, where you're moving in and out of a space. So same question, how do we move from a death trap to a safe haven for a building? And the solution is really to lower the risk of transmission as much as possible. And after that, to communicate how you're lowering the risk of transmission. And this comes back to the initial, the other solution for pollution, which is to communicate, collect the data, and build trust with your occupants. So something more technical, we're going to go into mechanisms of infection in buildings. There's really three ways that you can get it. One is directly touching the virus. So this might be touching something and then touching your face. Indirectly, which means you're touching something that has the virus on it, and then you touch your face. And lastly, airborne, which is the most dangerous. Aerosolized droplets, there's a lot of them when you cough. So 30,000 droplets going at 90 kilometers an hour, up to 50 meters in distance. 50 meters is a little bit far, but if you're looking at droplets that float in the air for a while, 50 meters is possible. So the reason why the virus can stay in the air for so long is because it's actually very, very small. So if we look at this image, that long, thick strand is hair. And then as we go smaller, it's dust. The blue is dust, and then the pink is PM2.5. So, and then PM2.5, after you get smaller, is influenza virus and stuff like that. And all of that all the viruses are much smaller than PM2.5. So, for example, influenza is zero point 0.1 um, micrometers. Oh, sorry, micrometers. Anyways, um, so here we're just showing image of droplets when you spit or cough. And so a virus can live or kind of stay within a respiratory fluid for a certain amount of time. And what this all has to do with anything is that COVID-19 plus droplets in the air means that it can stay in the air for a significantly longer amount of time. Research shows that there's a dramatic drop in percent transmission rates of viruses when humidity is kept within the zone of human comfort. And the reason for this is because when you can maintain humidity at a higher rate, droplets get heavier and they can sink. While if you keep it too dry, it's possible that the droplets get smaller and the viruses become light enough that they can float in the air for a significant longer amount of time. So what this means is in indoor environments, you have to consider a couple things. You're considering that, let's say, there's no way that we're not going to cough at all unless we're all wearing masks, where it will basically catch all the droplets. And most indoor spaces are opting for not having that. So we have to consider, how do we minimize the amount of transmission of viruses? And this is basically looking at how do we lower the amount of particles in the air. So a question to consider is, does the indoor space have a good temperature and relative humidity? Because this is how you lower the amount of potential viruses in the air. If you have a central HVAC system, you'll have to consider, how will return air affect the space? Will it cross-contaminate different offices? So return air is essentially bringing air from an office back into a central system to filter or whatever, and then bring it back out. So return air is now something that we have to think about that we never had to think about previously. And lastly, if I am bringing in fresh air, how will it affect temperature and relative humidity? So let's say in the winter, if you're bringing in fresh air, you're typically working with slightly drier air once it comes inside, because you've warmed everything up. So if you're working with dry air inside, that means that there's a longer particles. What is it? Particles from your mouth will come out and stay in the air for longer amounts of time. So this makes it complicated in the sense that experts are saying to ventilate the air to reduce COVID-19 risk, but really sometimes it depends on outside conditions. You have to consider whether or not at the end you're creating a dry, low relative humidity and a cold space, because that will affect transmission rates. So additionally, there's now research coming out that COVID-19 spreads faster with PM2.5, because there's a research that was recently published that showed COVID-19 RNA on particulate matter on PM2.5. So, which means that it's possible for the virus to get stuck on PM2.5 particles and get breathed in. And PM2.5 particles are known to float in the air for a little bit longer. So, for example, here, PM2.5 can stay airborne for up to 100 minutes. So now for buildings in China, we also have to consider outdoor temperature, humidity, and whether or not there's pollution. So for solutions, generally we're looking at, again, trying to build a safe haven. So from our perspective, we honestly believe that the way to do this, to build trust, to let tenants feel safe, is to communicate and to do communication properly, you have to have data to back it up. And that's how you would build trust. So to defeat fear and risk, you're really looking at communicating and building trust. And to build trust, you need to do three things. You need to measure, manage, and engage. So number one, measure. When you can measure, you can manage risk and user trust because they both require data. So earlier we talked about how there's direct, indirect, and airborne ways of transmission. With airborne, you can actually measure this because, as we said previously, it's affected by humidity, temperature, and PM2.5. So what if there was a system that gave you information on this stuff and then would tell you, for example, if there was a high risk because humidity was too low, and send you notifications. So this is just this is a product that is able to track data and send notifications. It's a way for you to at least understand what your space is like. And now I want to go a little bit more specific in how reset plays into the whole measurement part. Reset is a standard and certification for healthy buildings, and the goal of us, what we've been doing, is to make sure that data is analyzed live. So we get data updated at least every 5 minutes, averaged out into 30 minutes. Our focus has been on air and air quality, and we've also touched on, we're touching on energy and materials very soon. The way we work is there's third-party hardware that we accredit. So we designed a standard around what we think are minimum requirements for hardware, sensors, and monitors. The data gets uploaded into operations cloud, which compiles the data and organizes it into the format that is required for the analysis in the reset cloud. We've built standards for the monitors for how you install. So how essentially we're looking for how do you monitor a space. One of the simple rules is you want to always install your monitor somewhere between 1.2 to 1.8 meters high. So it's within the breathing zone of where most humans' height are. And you should have at least one monitor every 500 square meters because otherwise there's too much variance in the different spaces. And lastly, communication standards to make sure that all the data formats are aligned. We see ourselves as very collaborative because our focus has been on monitoring. We actually can slot into a lot of other standards that are in the industry. And just a quick look at projects that have done reset previous to COVID-19, because they've been thinking about how can we create a healthier environment, focusing on air quality first for their tenants and their occupants. Just as a little bonus, we've been working on a project with the World Green Building Council to monitor air quality across outdoor spaces. So we invite core and shell projects to be able to publish their outdoor data and be displayed on a map. So the second part is managing, and this is more straightforward. A lot of stuff is things that we've seen before, especially in China, because China's done a really good job of managing the entire COVID-19 crisis. So the very obvious things that we've seen everyone do is masks and hand sanitizers, and also information logging. So this is just, it's obvious, everyone's seen it. Something else that's going to be more common moving forward is in-tree control. So we've seen the temperature sensors. We're probably going to see more automated temperature sensors like the one that you see in the bottom image, where every building wants to check whether or not someone has a fever before they come into the building to protect against other people. Something else that can be considered, that a lot of buildings are already considering as people are moving into buildings again, is regular disinfection. So this is cleaning supplies, making sure that you feel safe. And lastly, it's personnel. So a lot of offices are allowing for people to work at home more often because it decreases the number of people in the office and also lowers the risk of you contracting anything while you're traveling. Honestly, most of this stuff doesn't apply quite as much to Shanghai anymore. This is more informative if you're currently in North America or Europe. So earlier I mentioned that return air and fresh air from outdoor might be a problem. So to do this, you might have to consider more technological solutions. So with HVAC optimization, you'll have to consider filtering and sterilizing more and possibly monitoring. Um, so you want to monitor the air to make sure that um, you know what's going on and that when you're doing your optimization, you're not creating another problem from it. One of the solutions we're looking at is UV. So one of the issues with UV is that you need a certain amount of time for the UV to actually break the fat, the lipid surrounding the virus. So it's only going to work if it's trying to disinfect a filtration net, but it's not going to work if you're just blowing air through it. And of course, the other thing to consider is to add humidifiers. So humidifiers will obviously be able to help you humidify the space, relevant for winters when indoor spaces typically are less humid. The last part of building trust, and honestly something that we think is probably the most important, is engaging. So engaging is engaging with your tenants. Something to do for that is communication. So what have you done already? What are you doing now? And what will you do? And we think in terms of prices or just anything, there's a lot for tenants and landlords to do together. So it's something we believe is if you're trying to achieve anything from, let's say, a crisis perspective, or even if you're trying to approach sustainability, landlords and tenants must work together. I'll give an example just with humidity. One of the issues with humidity is that if the tenant is expecting the landlord to help solve the humidity problem through central HVAC, it's not going to work because HVAC systems need to be dry. Otherwise, there's potential for mold. And so you don't want to build the humidity system into the central HVAC system. Instead, you want this to be more local. So just this image here is just describing considerations for what a federal system versus state system looks like. Knowing that there is a border between who's responsible for what is important, and it's once you have that border set up, you can communicate better in terms of who does what and how to help each other out. Something else in regards to tenant engagement is also just providing information and material resources for tenants from the landlord's perspective. So the landlord might have a lot of information collected from their standard via either a materials database or something that helps them be able to tell tenants on like what materials are good. And this plays into a larger role of what can you do in general for better air quality. So materials is obviously one of the factors for VOC and TVOC in indoor spaces. There is interest right now that we've heard where clients are looking at, or a landlord's looking at having an entire building get a database that every single tenant has to input into, and that allows them to track what materials are going into the building. So lastly, with the engage part, something that we've been working on is a leaderboard. So we want to help benchmark tenants against each other. And the goal of this is more from a health and sustainability perspective. the way it works is that we would uh, rank and and benchmark different tenants against each other. This is anonymous, and so you wouldn't see who the others are, but you would be able to see how you compare. And the goal of this is to incentivize teams to start exploring better solutions for how you can achieve certain metrics. So with COVID-19, this would be looking at, am I maintaining a really proper PM2.5 levels, humidity levels, temperature levels? Is there a difference between myself and a tenant elsewhere? And with this information, from a landlord's perspective, it's very interesting because now you get to talk with your tenants a lot more. There's a lot more ability to reach out to them and engage. And of course, there's with the leaderboard, there's a bunch of metrics and APIs that allow you to pull the data and display them. So lastly, in conclusion, I just want to say that we think that the most important part of what you do, regardless of how you handle it, is to first measure so you have the right information to use to manage whatever solutions that you have. And then lastly, it's communication. You must engage with your tenants to help them feel comfortable and build trust with them so they don't feel the fear and risk in coming back to the building or anything of that sort. Lastly, I just want to leave everyone with some food for thought. COVID-19 is a wake-up call, and it's a great time to reflect. I know this is a Green Initiatives webinar, so I know a lot of people care about sustainability and health in general. So it's interesting to think that this is not going to be the only crisis that we'll face, and how do we prepare for future threats? What can we do to hedge against future disruptive threats? Anyways, that's it from me. We can do a quick Q&A if there are any questions. It doesn't look like we have anything. Oh, someone has a question. Tana's Grant asks, some people have said that it's better to leave HVAC systems off to minimize airflow. What are my thoughts on that? I think that it depends on the building. It depends on how it's set up. So obviously with return air, it's now a problem. So it is something to consider whether or not you're creating a bigger problem than otherwise. So the things that you want to consider is airflow is definitely something, because if you have too much air blowing around, you're helping the particles stay airborne for longer. But you have to also consider whether or not, because COVID-19 is obviously one thing, but you also have to consider health of the people inside. So let me think. How would I approach this? The short-term answer, I think having systems shut off to minimize airflow and to minimize cross-contamination is a possible solution. But the long-term solution is to start monitoring the air. Also, maybe have return air be something that can be turned on or turned off. So, for example, if you know there's an office that has someone with a fever, for example, you don't have return air systems bring air from that space back out. Does that answer the question? Okay. So, I mean, part of this is also just communication with your landlord to understand how the system works. So if you're in an office building, it's going to be important to understand whether or not your system is connected to a bunch of other offices, and how they're looking at making sure the air that's being delivered is probably going to be safe. And also the airflow thing also depends on how the building's set up. Typically, there's not going to be a significant amount of wind being blown into the office. They've designed most HVAC systems to not feel like you're outdoors. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's more of the return air that's going to be a problem. Thank you very much, everybody.